The P-40 is definitely one of my favourite aircraft types, but it dawned on me that I've never actually built a later variant. So I thought I would fix that. Hello everyone, I'm Matt, this is Model Minutes, and join me on the workbench today as I build and review the AFV Club P-40N Warhawk in 1:144 scale. I've not actually done a detailed unboxing on this kit, partly because there's not a great deal to see, and also partly because I kinda just wanted to crack straight on with it. As you can see, it comes packaged in a plastic bag with a cardboard header and backing sheet. This features our instructions, which are relatively easy to follow, and the painting instructions are printed in full colour, which is fantastic to see. There is one clear plastic part for the canopy and it's moulded to a good quality, although perhaps the frame details are a little bit shallow. The remainder of the parts of the kit come on a olive green sprue. The moulding is to a good quality with not much flash being visible, and the level of detail reproduced for such a small scale is quite commendable, the details being recessed and raised as appropriate in places. We also get a sheet of decals, and I will talk about the decals a little bit later on, but generally they seem to be printed to a good quality, but they do suffer from excess decal film around the edges, which makes them somewhat larger than they need to be. On the whole though, it looks to be quite a nice little kit. Before I get too deep into the build, I'm going to pop a list of the products I used on the screen here to give you an idea of the kind of paints and things you might want to go and get if you fancy replicating the results I achieve in this video. And with all of that out of the way, let's get into it. As is normal, I remove the parts from the sprue. I'll either use a sharp knife or my side cutters. The parts are quite small and fragile, so I do have to take a little bit of care here. Any rough areas of plastic can then be sanded smooth using a sanding stick. My cement of choice will be Tamiya Extra Thin. The first thing to do was glue in the control panel. There is a kind of representation of a control panel in this kit, but the cockpit details are pretty sparse. But given the scale, that's kind of to be expected. With that done, the other fuselage half was snapped into place as well, and I must admit that this goes together really nicely. It's almost a snap fit kit, but some glue does have to be used. With the fuselage assembled, the wings could be added as well. Again, these snap into place. And then the tail surfaces were added to the rear of the aircraft. There is an air intake which needs to be glued onto the lower side of the model, and then I added the drop tanks. The drop tank goes into moulded holes, so if you didn't want to use this, you'd have to fill in those holes. The propeller and spinner comes as a single part, and this was pushed on for now, but I can remove it for painting if it becomes easier. I then moved on to the landing gear. This kit comes with the option to raise or lower the landing gear, and I opted initially to go for the lowered landing gear option. However, having installed one of the landing gear legs, I inadvertently knocked it and the part vanished into the ether. I believe the carpet monster now has that one because I simply couldn't find it again. So having lost one of the landing gear legs, I decided to instead go for the wheels up option. I added the raised landing gear parts onto the main landing gear bays and then turned my attention to the rear tail wheel. The P-40 in real life had a tail wheel that would retract inside of the aircraft. However, this is one of the small problems with this kit, and that is that the tail wheel is permanently moulded in the lowered position, and there are no parts included to replicate it being raised. This was relatively straightforward to modify though. I cut away the tail wheel and then scored along the lines of the doors. They were then carefully folded in, with a little bit of sanding required to smooth everything over. After this, I moved on to some painting. This Vallejo interior yellow colour was used on the cockpit. It is airbrush ready, but I decided I would hand paint it simply for speed, and a couple of thin coats were needed. Because I am now displaying this aircraft in a flying condition, I need a pilot. Sadly, no pilot is included, so I scavenged my model railway spares boxes and found this seated passenger from an N-gauge figure set. It's not perfect, it's quite crude, but I think it will do with some modification. Having cut and trimmed this figure to make it look more like a pilot, and one that would actually fit, it was given a lick of paint with some suitable colours which could replicate some flight clothes. Before I can add this pilot though, I need to paint the control panel with some Vallejo black. Again, this was done by hand very carefully. And then with that done, the homemade pilot figure was glued into place. As we saw earlier, the cockpit canopy comes in a single piece, and this was glued into place here as well. Now I can turn my attention to some painting. I've opted not to actually prime this aircraft. Instead, I'm going to just paint straight onto the plastic. For the lower side, I've decided to go with Tamiya XF19 Sky Grey, which is thinned down with some X28 acrylic thinner. I've heard in various places that hand painting Tamiya acrylics is not possible, but I've been able to achieve it on many occasions, and this is one of them. I do find that you do have to make sure you keep the paint as wet as possible until it has dried, before being tempted to overcoat with a second or third coat. If you do this though, you should have a relatively smooth paint layer. I didn't quite have the right camouflage green colour, so I decided to mix together these two Vallejo paints with a little thinner to get the kind of desired shade that I was looking for. This was then carefully hand painted onto the upper surfaces, using some careful brush control to get quite neat separation between this and the lower grey I've just painted. Again, a couple of thin coats might be needed for good opacity. The canopy frames were also painted with this colour, and I did this by hand quite carefully just to make sure I got it in the right places. If I do get anything in the wrong place though, I can carefully scrape it away using a cocktail stick. This paint scheme actually has some darker blotches on the tail surface, and I tried using this olive brown colour to replicate that, but actually I found this one just didn't really do it and it didn't look noticeable. So instead I opted to swap out to this olive green, which is a little bit more vibrant and should stand out a little more. With that done and everything dry, it was time to clear coat the entire aircraft. I'm simply going to use some Humbrol clear gloss, and this was painted over the entire aircraft with a couple of thin coats being applied. And now that that gloss has dried, it's time to turn my attention to the decals. As I mentioned earlier, these are printed to a nice quality, but they do have some excess film. Some of this excess film was carefully cut away to make sure that it didn't overlap the edges of the model's parts. They were then soaked in warm water and allowed to release from the backing paper. As is quite normal, microscale set and sol will be used as my setting solutions to help them soften into the surface. Microset was painted onto the relevant areas of the model, the decals were slid into position and carefully aligned, and then some more microset was applied to soften them down onto the surface details. After they've settled a little bit, some microsol from the red bottle would be brushed over the top just to ensure that they settled into all of those recessed panel lines and details. The decal application stage was relatively straightforward, and I didn't encounter any problems other than having to trim the transfers as I previously mentioned. It is worth noting, however, that you only get one decal scheme included in the kit, but I would have liked to have had a choice. With those decals now applied, I brushed on some more clear gloss. This will help seal them in and protect them in the next stages. And the next stages are a little bit of weathering. I've got this Humbrol blue-grey enamel wash which I thinned down with some white spirit to make it a lot more thinner and a lot less vibrant. This was painted over the entire aircraft, and my hope here is that it will run into all those recessed details and add some more contrast to them. I don't want it to be too heavy though. especially given such a small scale. This effect could be quite overbearing. If there was any excess wash that I wasn't happy with, a cotton bud with some white spirit on would be used in the direction of airflow to carefully remove any of this excess wash. And then when that was fully dry, I moved on to a matte varnish. This K-Colors varnish is meant to be used through an airbrush, but actually I found it worked relatively okay, being applied by hand as well. Perhaps the results aren't quite as matte as I would like, but I think it will do. With that done, I moved on to this Vallejo black. I carefully painted the propeller blades and then the tyres of the wheels on the lower side of the aircraft. Vallejo silver was used to pick out the pitot tube on the wing, as well as the hubs on the wheels and the landing gear support struts. Ammo MIG gunmetal was used on the machine gun barrels on the wings and also on the engine exhausts on the nose. I also decided to use a combination of these two colours to create some sort of chipping effects. This was done by hand using a very fine tipped brush, and I applied it to the areas where perhaps this aircraft is walked over or receives maintenance or rearming. So around the various panels that perhaps are removed more frequently, it would see some more of this paintwork chipped. After this, it was time to add a little bit of staining. So I've actually got this sample from Humbrol for some aging powders. I decided first up I would try the black powder to simulate engine exhaust staining and also gun smoke from the gun ports. This was loaded onto a very dry brush and then carefully streaked in the direction of airflow. Given the very small scale, I had to be super careful to try and make these results look convincing. I didn't want to apply too much. I did find the engine exhaust staining to not be particularly vibrant though, so I did add a little of the rust pigment as well to the engine exhaust staining on the nose, which I think gives a slightly better look over the green camouflage. Reattaching the propeller on the nose, the aircraft is pretty much complete. However, as it's in flight, I need a way to display it. Sadly, it doesn't come with a display stand, so I'm going to have to make my own. I have got one of these Humbrol paint pots. Sadly, the paint has dried out, but I think I might be able to use the lid. I drilled out a small hole in the centre of the lid, and then superglued a piece of thin wire into this hole. Some liquid gravity would be added onto the lid as well to give it weight and help keep it quite stable. Once this liquid gravity was glued into place, I would apply some model filler over the top to hide the fact that it was there and make it look a little neater. This would be sanded when dry and then given a coat of black primer to blend everything in and make it look a little bit better. With that done, all I had to do was drill out a hole in the bottom of the aircraft to accept the display stand wire, cut the wire to the correct length, and then glue on the aircraft. And with that, I'm going to call my build of the AFV Club P-40N Warhawk in 144th scale complete. And there we go, the first later variant of the P-40 that I've built is now complete. So what do I think of this kit? Well, objectively, it's quite a nice little model. It features some really nicely detailed parts externally, not to mention the raised up landing gear option, and I'm pretty sure this does actually share parts with other variants of the P-40 available from the AFV Club range. So you might notice a couple of those on the sprue if you get one of these for yourself. Although this does have the raised landing gear option, I was a little bit annoyed about the fact the tail wheel is moulded on in the lowered position, but as you saw during the build, it was a relatively easy fix to replicate it as if it was raised. Annoyingly, no pilot figure is included, but once again I did manage to overcome that myself. The instructions are easy to follow. The painting instructions are printed in colour, which is great, but sadly we only get one decal scheme included. I would have preferred to see a couple more. The decals were perfectly fine, although that film, as mentioned, protruded further than it needed to and had to be cut away. I opted to paint this one completely by hand given the small size of the model and didn't really feel it justified getting the airbrush out for such a little project. Although it was a little project, I think you probably could do this one in a day or even in an afternoon if you work quickly, but for full disclosure this actually took me 8 days, but that was because I was so busy with other commitments. But seeing as this kit does only comprise of 17 parts, and it almost snaps together, it is a pretty quick and simple build. There are only a couple of things that might be worth mentioning, and that is the lack of cockpit detail, the lack of a pilot and that tail wheel as mentioned previously, but I also think that the P-40N Warhawk did have a couple of extra details which don't seem to be replicated in this kit. I think there may have been a circular antenna behind the cockpit, but I wonder if they omitted that due to the restrictions of injection moulding such a small and fragile part. The only thing that really bugs me about this kit is the high price. Whilst this is a relatively recent tooling, dating from 2015, and it does feature lots of the details and qualities that we expect from recent toolings, its recommended retail price of £10.99 here in the UK does seem a little bit high for what we get included in the kit. As mentioned, we only have 17 parts and one decal scheme. Personally, I would like to see this kit at a cheaper price, and I'm sure if you shop around that may well be possible. But with that small criticism out of the way, on the whole I thoroughly enjoyed this build. If I had to pick up a couple of points from my own personal skills, I would say that the canopy isn't necessarily the neatest. I would have preferred to mask this, but given the small size I just didn't really have the capacity for it. And also the hand painting on such a small scale was a little bit tricky, and maybe the surface paint isn't quite as smooth as I could normally achieve. But from normal viewing distances it doesn't look too bad. Granted, of course, with the camera zoomed in as much as it is for this video, it can be a little unforgiving. But what do you think of my build of this AFV Club P-40N Warhawk, and do you think my assessment of it was fair? Let me know down in the comments. As always, I'd like to give a quick shout out to my Model Club members for the extra support they give the channel. A massive thanks to these guys on screen, and if you'd like to join them or support the channel in other ways, full information is below the video. The best way to help support this channel for free though, and to see more content like this, is by subscribing with your notifications turned on so you never miss a modelling upload. Finally though, last thing from me is a massive thank you to you for watching this one, and I'll see you on the workbench again next time.